Welcome once again, everyone. This is, of course, the fertility live stream, but this time we will be having the IVF Journal Club live stream featuring, of course, Dr. Oybek Rostomov, fertility specialist practicing in Adora Fertility Brisbane. This afternoon, Dr. Oybek will talk about a research paper about transfer of fresh versus frozen embryos in ovulatory women. This live stream is being broadcast across, of course, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and other social media platforms. And those who are watching right now can also message us and send it in via rostomov.com.au or simply send a direct message to our official Facebook page. Mainly, Dr. Oybek Rostomov will be doing a critical appraisal of this research as well later on, and he will be explaining more of that in just a little while. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome right now, of course, Dr. Oybek Rostomov. Doc, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, JC. Good evening, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining this live stream. If you're watching later on, thanks for watching the video. So we are actually kicking off a new series, which is IVF Journal Club. So here we will be discussing research papers and critically appraising research papers. So today is this first live stream on the series. In today's live stream, we will discuss why we actually need another IVF series. We already got one series going, why we need another one. And the second is we will actually discuss this paper on fresh versus frozen embryo transfer, randomized controlled trial. Then the third, we critically appraise this paper using CASP methodology. So, and let us first address why we're actually doing this Journal Club live stream. So, we are today inundated with a number of publications in all fields of science and medicine. So it's really so difficult to keep up with all published research study. So we need to develop some kind of methodology skills to sort out good research from the bad ones first, and then we should be able to develop methodology to keep up with the published work. So I'll give you this example. Let us say if you go on PubMed and if you search for cited papers on the PubMed, an article under search term of infertility, which is very relevant to what we do. So you get more than 100,000 research articles. Okay, so then you can say, okay, let us narrow it down. We don't want to be reading, all the research papers. Let us look at the last 20 years because this is where this most research papers we use for clinical practice is published. Then when you even narrow it down, then you will have a 71,000 research articles. So pretty much, if you want to be really thorough in the field where you practice in infertility, then you have to be more or less aware of this all published potential research evidence. So let us say, as a young resident who just finished medical school at the age of 26, they determined they want to do infertility. They want to just keep up and catch up with all the published research. Pretty much they determined that, they will read all the papers, and even if they allocate all their professional working life on this, if they read one article per hour, because it needs a lot of analysis of the article, and if they read 5 articles a day, 5 hours a day, so in 365 days in a year, they managed to read and review 2,920 articles. So it takes them 24 years of focused reading and analyzing to catch up with the backlog and clear all the 71,000 research articles. So then, which takes us to 2046, but because they're catching up with all research, then they have got the backlog of another 165,000 published research waiting to clear the remaining of the backlog. Because let us say even in last year, 2021, 6,800 research papers were published under the search term of infertility. So it's actually growing exponentially, even if the rate doesn't grow. So, within 24 years, while they're catching up with old paper, then they have got another 165,000 papers. So even if they dedicate their life, they will never be able to catch up with published research in a very narrow field of medicine, which is fertility. So then they may decide, okay, let us make it simpler. We will just focus on IVF. Then again, if to look at the 20 years worth of research articles in IVF alone, they have to read 24,000 articles. So it takes 8 years to clear the backlog. And after 8 years in 2030, they have 18,000 papers waiting for reading. So, and because even only last year alone, there was like 2,320 articles published on PubMed. This is the articles cited on PubMed, and there's so many other research pieces, articles presented in conferences and published in different languages, which is not an English language, and they never come to the PubMed. And it's just impossible even to be aware of the names of these articles. So that's quite overwhelming. So then they may say, okay, why do we care? Do we actually care about so many research articles? Do we actually need to read or know these articles? You can just say no, we don't. We just focus few articles here and there, but the problem is, so these articles, published research articles, are potentially research evidences. They creep into our daily clinical practice. The articles get read by colleagues and presented in conferences, and even like brought up by even patients saying, oh, there's a research which says you have to be giving me this drug. So if you're not careful, if you don't do critical appraisal of the papers, some odd thousands of research articles can influence our decision making in daily practice. So if you look at this intervention map of IVF cycle, for given that we have got 71,000 papers in infertility, like 24,000 papers in IVF alone. So for each of these interventions, you can find hundreds of research papers supporting the intervention and hundreds of research papers rejecting effectiveness of research papers, which can be very, very confusing unless we get a very good handle on published research in our field. Okay, so this is one of the reasons why we actually decided to do critical appraisal of research papers, so that we together we will develop knowledge base, and we can identify which actually research papers out of this thousands of research papers are worthwhile to take into account in our daily practice and implement in daily practice, and which ones we can safely reject, saying, look, we did actually critical appraisal to get together on LiveStream online. We understood this research paper should not be implemented. Research evidence should not be implemented in medical practice. So yeah, so and also as you know, we are running another live stream which is on IVF series, which discuss each of these factors, 55 steps of IVF treatment. And when we do the critical appraisal of research papers, we know the role of each individual factor in determining the outcome of IVF. And we're also planning to run another live stream series, which is IVF analysis live stream series, where we actually analyze individual IVF cycles, and then we analyze, discuss how we can actually analyze IVF outcomes in the population, in the clinics, in the individual patient outcomes. For that, we have to know first role of each individual step and factor, and research evidence behind of implementation of each individual intervention in IVF. So this is why if you have 3 different series, one is on steps, practical steps of IVF, second, critical appraisal of important research evidence on IVF, and the third is building the skills on analysis, statistical analysis, data modeling, and individual patient data analysis in IVF. So these 3 things will help each other for us to have a comprehensive understanding and building the knowledge and the skills and clinical practice. Okay, so the first step of today's live stream has been finished. So we now determined why we actually have to do IVF Journal Club. Now we move on to the second part where I will actually present this research paper step by step before moving to the third part, which is critical appraisal of research paper. So we're discussing today the paper titled as a transfer of fresh versus frozen embryos in ovulatory women. So this paper was published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2018. So okay, so this research was conducted in Shandong province of China, so led by Shandong University Hospital Clinic, Provincial Hospital Clinic, and in conjunction with the 20 other regional IVF clinics. This is a multi-center randomized controlled trial on fresh versus frozen transfer in ovulatory women. So it's very important from outset to identify the patient population. So they determined that the patient's population will be from the age of 20 to 35, undergoing first cycle of IVF in non-PCOS patients. So this, if any patients undergoing IVF treatment on this in this clinics in Shandong province of China were invited to participate. So the recruitment took place within 6 months period in 2015. It's quite impressive actually. Within 6 months, they managed to collect so many patients. Invite so many patients and conduct the research study. I assume that the clinics were quite busy. Okay, so let us discuss the whole research methodology and protocol. So essentially, they invited all patients undergoing first IVF cycle, and all patients were given the same FSH drug, Purigon, ranging from 75 units to 225 units daily dose of Purigon, starting from third day here. All of them had started Purigon on the third day of of menstrual period. Then pituitary down regulation was achieved using organotron, which means they were all in antagonist protocol. So once one or two follicle reached 18 millimeters or larger, then the patient had the HCG trigger, and after 34 to 36 hours, they had egg pickup procedure. Remember, this was done in 20 different clinics, but they all followed the same protocol for patients who were recruited for the study, invited to the study, not invited to the study. So now it's a very important point is randomization. So randomization, of course, in RCT means that once patients are invited and recruited for the study, so then they start the intervention. When certain time comes, that patients are randomized into two different groups. One is control group, and second one is treatment group. So here, randomization happened at the time of egg pickup. So once egg pickup was done, then patients were randomized using block randomization, 1-to-1 ratio, either to fresh cycle or fresh transfer cycle or frozen embryo transfer cycle. So exclusion criteria at the time of randomization was two. One is getting less than 5 eggs, because if patients have less than 5 eggs, there's a higher likelihood that they may not have any embryos to transfer. That's why these patients were excluded from randomization process. And the second is if patient was at risk of OHSS. So if patient had a very high response, they were not randomized, because if patient gets OHSS, then they may not be able to have a fresh transfer. They may need to have a freeze-all. So that's why these two group of patients were excluded. So in the first fresh IVF fresh transfer group, 1,080 patients were allocated, and to freeze or frozen embryo transfer group, 1,077 patients were allocated. Very similar number. So then Patients who are like allocated to have a fresh embryo transfer had their embryos checked on day 2 or day 3. I think it's depending on clinic protocol. Some clinics, I assume, that routinely day 2 transfer, and other clinics did day 3 transfer. So either on day 2 or day 3, the embryos were assessed, and 2 or less top grade embryo was selected and transferred, and the remaining embryos were cultured to blastocyst stage and frozen. So it's a very important point here. Point here is embryos were transferred on cleavage stage, day 2 or day 3. And also another important point: the number of embryos transferred is 2 or less than 2. So okay, so the patients who are randomized to frozen embryo transfer group had the embryos checked again on day 2 or day 3. So then the embryos were 2 top grade embryos were frozen. The remaining good grade embryos were incubated until blastocyst stage, and if they reached clinic's criteria for freezing, and they were frozen. Okay, so next, out of 1,080 patients in fresh transfer group, 915 were adherent to the protocol. So which means they managed to complete the protocol. If they were allocated to fresh and they completed the treatment. So 15% of patients out of 1,080 withdrew from the study or had a protocol deviation. So withdrew means they just didn't complete the study, or they actually changed their plan. They were allocated to fresh transfer, but they decided to do frozen transfer and requested to freeze their embryos. So in other arm, which is a frozen transfer arm, out of 1,077 patients, 874 completed the study. It's fairly similar number. So the difference may be 25 plus 35 patients less in this arm. And 18% in this arm withdrew from the study or had a deviation of protocol. In fact, actually, they were allocated to frozen group, and a lot of them changed and requested to have a fresh embryo transfer. Okay, so this is an observation in terms of withdrawal and protocol deviation. So in terms of luteal phase support, that may be relevant. So patients who had a fresh transfer had a HCG trigger, egg pickup, and immediately started luteal phase support, which is Crinon and Dufaston, and continued luteal support till 10 weeks of gestation. So in luteal support was slightly different in frozen cycle. So in patients who had a frozen transfer, so waited 1 month after fresh IVF cycle and started frozen embryo transfer cycle in their natural cycle. The first transfer was in natural frozen cycle. If that cycle didn't work, let us say natural frozen cycle, they had 2 embryo transfer. If cycle didn't work, then the next cycle was HRT frozen cycle. Probably patient when, although this says ovulatory women, some women may not ovulate every month, and if they didn't ovulate next month, they had a HRT frozen cycle. And interestingly, in the frozen cycle, a luteal phase support was slightly different because they had only Dufaston. Probably because it's believed that in fresh cycles we need more progesterone than HRT cycles. So that's why they had a double HRT. The question is whether this had any effect on the outcome, whether this additional Crinon, additional luteal support was beneficial in the fresh arm. So yeah. Okay, so this is a whole presentation of the paper. And I completed the presentation. Now we can move to analysis section.
That's right. Thank you so much, Doc, for that. Now, mainly again, just for everybody's information, Dr. Obeck will and I will be doing of course, more of Dr. Obeck will be doing a critical appraisal of this research on transfer of fresh versus frozen embryo in ovulatory women. And a little later, right after this slide, I'll be asking some questions, of course, with regards to the appraisal. Of course, CESP from UK, this is based for the Critical Appraisal Skills Program of UK. And for everyone's information, it is the process of carefully and systematically examining research to judge its trustworthiness and its value and relevance in a particular context. Critical appraisal is also essential to combat information overload, identify papers that are clinically relevant. Some issues or aspects needed to be considered when appraising a randomized controlled trial or RCT are its validity, methods, and of course results. So I suppose, Doc, we can move on with some questions.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, I need to go back there to the same page. Yeah, so thanks, JC. So essentially, this part of the the presentation is a very
Mm,
kind of matter of fact, dry, and very bureaucratic, because here we have to follow a preset protocol, which is developed by Critical Appraisal Skills Program based in UK. So we're using their protocol to go through the stages of appraisal. So we cannot add anything to that protocol. We cannot add our opinion. So it's kind of really dry, bureaucratic appraisal of this particular research.
that's right. So there, I suppose we can move on with the process. And the first one is, of course, about validity. Here are some questions. First one is, did the study address a clearly focused research question?
Yes. Here they're saying, was the study designed to assess outcomes of intervention? Is the research
Mhm,
question focused in terms of
mhm.
population, intervention, comparator, outcomes measured? Yes, 100%. They actually predefined all these four parameters, and this is why we think that yes, study addressed clearly focused research question.
All right. Thank you so much, Doc, for that. Now, next one would be, of course, was the assignment of participants to interventions randomized?
Yes, absolutely. And they clearly defined a randomization process. Actually, it was centralized randomization. This is best form of randomization, where actually the participants, like in terms of assessors, are not involved. So essentially, centralized randomization team randomized patients and told them which patient belongs where, and it was very well described in the paper, and this is why we think that the answer is yes to this question.
Thank you so much, Doc. Now, next validity question here that I have is, were all participants who entered the study accounted for at its conclusion?
Yes, absolutely. They give this graph here. They described in total 2,157 patients were randomized, and they were allocated into two groups, and they accounted for all the patients in each group. Of course, there was a lot of deviation and a lot of withdrawal from the study, but they actually did tell how many patients divide, how many patients withdrew from the study. Yes, answer to this question is yes.
Thank you so much, Doc. Now, I suppose we can move on with some methods, of course, for the blinding, if I'm not mistaken. So, question here would be were the study groups similar at the start of the randomized controlled trial?
Yes. Okay, so a person said, okay, yeah, both per blinded investigation, giving part of the investigation by intervention. I think we are in. Oh yeah. Okay, so I will read out this the blinding. Yes. So in terms of blinding, were the participants blind to the intervention? No. Practically, it would be impossible, because participants, which is the patients, uh, they had to know whether they're doing fresh transfer or frozen transfer. They could not do dummy fresh or dummy frozen. It would be too ethically not correct. So no, they were not blinded. I don't think that affects the primary outcome, which is live birth, whether the participant knew or not. Were investigators blind to the intervention? No. Again, doctors, investigators have to know whether the patient is having fresh transfer or frozen transfer. But importantly, what the people assessing and analyzing outcomes blinded cannot tell, because the research paper doesn't say whether people who actually did statistical analysis knew which patient belonged where, and that it would be possible to blind them, because by anonymization, you can blind assess statisticians. They might have done, but they didn't tell on the paper. This way, I cannot tell. So both the study groups similar at the start of
Mm-hmm.
randomization at control trial. You asked JC. Yes, they were, because this table gives characteristics of participants at the baseline, which means before randomization, at the time of randomization. So they were described here as per age, which is very important, fertility history, causes of infertility, and all this FSH and all of the parameters were very similar. So they were very comparable. Yes, answer is yes.
All right, thank you so much, Doc, for that one. Now, I suppose we can move on with the next series of questions. And thank you, Doc, for going through the blinding questions that I missed a while ago. So here we go with the next set of questions, I suppose. First one is apart from the, I'm sorry, this one that I have here is, there you go. Apart from the experimental intervention, did each study group receive the name or the same level of care?
Yes, so looking at this, the chart which I prepared reading through the paper, so as far as I know, the both groups had the same or similar treatment, except having embryo transfer in a fresh cycle, which is intervention, or frozen cycle, which is intervention. Except maybe, as I mentioned, there's additional progesterone to luteal phase support was given. If it was just protocol of the clinics, then I assume that's fine. Probably they could have given Crinon here as well, additional dose. There's no harm, but ethically they felt that it's not should not be given. So overall, by and large, yes, participants were given a similar treatment except intervention. Answer is yes.
All right, thank you so much, Doc. Now let's move on with the results. Here's the results question that I'd like to ask you. Were the effects of intervention reported comprehensively with all those considerations below as well?
Yes, yes. So they actually reported very comprehensively each result. And in terms of here, it says, was a power calculation undertaken? Yes, power calculation was undertaken. Study was powered to find 10% absolute difference in live births. We will come back to that. And in terms of 5% to detect 5% accuracy, so p-value was 0.05. So yeah, and in terms of power calculation, so they wanted to find 10% difference in absolute terms, which means, okay, let us say if they thought if in fresh transfer arm, live birth rate when the two embryos transferred at cleavage stage is 45%. So then they wanted to see if there would be like 10% increase in intervention group, 55. In clinical terms, it's a very big jump. Yeah. So in one single intervention, it's very unlikely that one single intervention can change a live birth rate by 10% in IVF. Usually, any intervention usually changes live births very minimally, maybe 2%, 3%. If it's really good intervention, because IVF outcomes are multifactorial. One factor rarely changes this much. So, 5% increase would be better, but it would have needed many more patients, because if you want to improve precision on RCT, you need more and more patients. Usually, you compromise on the precision, and you put big increase like 10%, so that you need a lesser number of patients. Of course, it's really difficult to enroll RCTs or in any field of medicine, especially in IVF. So, but this creates another problem, which can create type 2 error. In type 2 error means there may be actual difference between fresh and frozen. Because it was powered in such a big jump, you may end up not finding it. Let us assume a fresh transfer may give 5% higher live birth rate. With this power, you would not be able to detect it.
Mm.
This is my biggest criticism of this paper, but I understand complexity of doing RCTs. If they powered the study for 5% increase in live births and enrolled maybe two times more patients, then that would be ideal. But I know it's not easy to do. So yeah, but they described results in very detailed, in very systematic manner, and that's why effective interventions were reported comprehensively.
All right, thank you so much, Doc. Now, here's the second question on the results. What is or was the precision of the estimate of the intervention or treatment effect reported?
Yes, it was reported. We can see here they reported confidence interval quite narrow, 0.89 to 1.06. So p-value is 0.5. So yeah. So actually, by the way, we didn't report the result. Result of the study was in
Mhm.
live births in fresh transfer group, 50% patients had a live birth. In frozen group, 48%. It's quite higher live births. Probably these are very leading clinics, and also patient population was young. This was, and they had up to two embryos transferred. I think more than 90% of couples patients had the two embryo transfer. That's why they have such a high live birth. But this was very comparable. And in conclusion of the study was live birth rate did not differ significantly
Mhm.
in fresh embryo transfer and frozen embryo transfer among ovulatory women. Yes, so precision and confidence interval was reported.
All right, thank you so much, Doc. Now, lastly, here is another question on the results, of course. Do the benefits of the experimental intervention outweigh the harms and the cost?
Yeah, so here says what was the size of intervention and treatment effect? What were the harms
Hmm.
unintended? Yeah, so yeah, they answered most of these questions, but they didn't do cost effectiveness analysis. And here says in terms of clinical, they reported clinical harms and benefits. For that, answer is yes, but because for completeness sake, I should say cannot tell because they didn't do cost effectiveness analysis.
Mm. All
Yes,
right. Yes, Doc.
yes, Jesse. So I think we completed the
Hmm.
whole systematic review process. So this systematic review of this paper or any randomized controlled trial can be conducted using these three criteria. First is validity of the research. Second, methodology of the research. Then results, reporting of results. Very important when we're actually reading the papers, given we have got 71,000 papers to finish. So if the answer here in the when we are is assessing validity, no, we should immediately bin the paper. We should not even go to methodology and results. Waste our time to analyze, because if paper is not valid, if the paper is not studying clearly focused research question, if patients were not randomized when they're saying actually it's an RCT, and randomization did not take a place, and participants in the study were not accounted fully, and doesn't matter how good the paper is in face value, and whichever journal published, doesn't matter which New England Journal of Medicine or BMJ, whichever journal published, it doesn't really matter. So, and you should just answer these three questions. If the answer is no, you can safely bin the paper and don't use it in clinical practice. So now we're coming to the point deciding whether we should bin this paper or keep in our library.
Hmm.
So keep bin or keeping on in our library and use in research paper. So between these two options, I think we should keep this paper in a library because it adds important piece of clinical research evidence, and which can be utilized in clinical practice. But we should be uh, aware of um, shortfalls of the paper, which is low power of the power in terms of power of the paper. It was I think it was really underpowered paper. We should be always aware. We cannot 100% rely on this paper. Yes, this adds to another piece in the puzzle. Most likely, which means most likely, fresh and frozen embryo transfer in IVF cycles give similar outcomes. Thank you. So this is end of our first presentation on Journal Club.
Thank you so much, Doc. Thank you so much. And that's IVF Journal Club on transfer of fresh versus frozen embryos in ovulatory women with Dr. Oybek Rostomov. And to everyone, please go ahead and check out all our social media pages and our website, rostomov.com.au, for more information. Doc, please do invite them again for the next live stream that they'll be watching out for.
Thank you. Thanks, Jesse. We will be continuing. So later on, once we settle in this live stream, then we have a very predictable schedule where we can stick to it. So at the moment, we're just establishing all these live streams. Yes, we will be continuing Journal Club, maybe once or twice a week, and we will be continuing our IVF series live stream. Thanks everyone for joining today, and I wish you a great day ahead. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doc. See you all again tomorrow, everybody, for another exciting discussion. Please join us again for another episode of the live stream with Dr. Oybek Rostomov. Thank you and enjoy your evening.
Thank you.